Christmas Eve is supposed to be the warmest night of the year inside a house. It is supposed to be the night when everything the household means is most itself, when the presence of children is most vivid and most loud, when the ordinary details of domestic life are gathered together and lit from within by something that is not quite sentiment, but is the thing that sentiment gestures toward, the accumulated weight of a family in the same place at the same time, aware of itself and glad. On the night of December 24th, 1945, the Sodder household in Fayetteville, West Virginia, was exactly that. George and Jennie Sodder had 10 children, and on that Christmas Eve, 9 of them were home, and the house held all of them in the specific abundance of a home that is full, that is completely and entirely occupied, that leaves no empty rooms and no empty seats, that in its fullness represents everything a man who came to this country with almost nothing had managed to build across 20 years of work and family and small-town life in the mountains of West Virginia. By morning, 5 of those children were gone. The house was ash, and in the 50 years that followed, across the rest of 2 lives spent in the specific agony of a grief that could not settle into itself because it could never be made certain, George and Jennie Sodder would never know what had happened to Maurice and Martha, and Louis, and Jennie Jr., and Betty. They would search, they would advertise, they would hire investigators, they would receive letters, they would post the faces of their missing children on a billboard on Route 16 that stood for 40 years, that millions of people drove past, that became one of the most recognized images of unexplained loss in American history. And they would die, George in 1969 and Jennie in 1989, without an answer, without certainty, without the specific closure that even the most devastating of losses usually provides, which is the knowledge, however terrible, of what actually happened. That is the case. That is what the Sodder disappearance is, at its most essential. Not a crime story with a resolution, not a mystery solved by patient investigation, but a wound that remained open for more than 4 decades, because the thing that would have closed it, the simple, verifiable knowledge of whether 5 children burned to death or were taken alive from a burning house on a December night in 1945, was never established. And the reason it was never established, the specific combination of investigative failure and suspicious circumstance, and the particular vulnerabilities of a family that was, in some ways, more isolated and more exposed than their neighbors, is the story that the case carries, and that still carries within it, nearly 80 years after the fire, a question that no one has yet answered. George Sodder was not born George Sodder. He was born Giorgio Soddu in 1895 in Sardinia, the Italian island in the Mediterranean, whose people have their own history and their own dialect and their own particular relationship to the Italian mainland and to the wider world of Italian emigration that sent millions of people across the Atlantic in the first decades of the 20th century. He came to America as a young man, drawn by the same combination of economic necessity and the specific pull of a country that presented itself to the world as a place where work and determination could produce a life that the old world could not have offered. And he made his way eventually to West Virginia, where coal and industry and the specific labor demands of an extractive economy had created employment for men willing to work hard in difficult conditions. He changed his name. This was common enough among immigrants of his generation, the practical translation of an identity that American employers and neighbors found difficult to pronounce into something that fit more smoothly into the linguistic world of the place he had chosen to live. He became George Sodder, and he built around that name a life that would have looked, to any casual observer, like a success by any reasonable measure. He ran a trucking business. He owned property. He had married Jennie Cipriani, also Italian by birth and background, a woman of considerable strength and capability, who was in every visible way his equal partner in the construction of the life they built together. They had children. 10 children, across the years of their marriage, a family that would have been large by most standards, and that was, by the standards of the Italian immigrant community and the rural West Virginia community in which they had established themselves, a mark of prosperity and vitality, and the specific kind of social solidity that comes from having people around you who carry your name and your history. The children, by Christmas Eve of 1945, ranged from their eldest John, who was 23 years old, down to little Sylvia, who was 2. The 5 who would disappear occupied the middle of that range. Maurice was 14, Martha 12, Louis 9, Jennie Jr 8, and Betty 5. They were old enough to be distinct people, old enough to have personalities and preferences, and the specific individual character that children develop as they move through the years of childhood, old enough to be known by the people of Fayetteville as recognizable individuals rather than simply as Sodder children, as part of the household's collective identity. Maurice was the kind of boy who liked to take things apart and understand how they worked. Martha helped her mother in the house with the particular competence of a 12-year-old girl who has been given real responsibility and risen to it. Louis was small for his age and imaginative. Jennie Jr was spirited and unquiet. Betty was the baby of the 5, only 5 years old, the one who would have been tucked in earliest on Christmas Eve, the one whose stocking was already hung with the specific confidence of a child for whom Christmas is still entirely magical. On that Christmas Eve, the family had celebrated in the ordinary way of families in that time and place, with the decorations and the food and the anticipation that the holiday carried. George and Jennie had stayed up after the children went to bed, attending to the things that parents attend to on Christmas Eve, the presents and the arrangements, and the quiet pleasure of a house that is full and sleeping. Jennie had gone to bed sometime after midnight. George stayed up a little longer. By his own account, when he finally went to bed, everything in the house was as it should have been. The tree was lit, the stockings were hung, the children were asleep upstairs. He was awakened, sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning, by a sound that he could not immediately place, and by the time he was fully awake and had understood what the sound was and had opened his eyes and looked toward the door of the room, the hallway was lit by something that was not the ordinary light of a winter night, but something brighter and more orange, and moving in the specific way that fire moves when it has already found its footing in a structure and begun to climb. The house was on fire. What followed, in the minutes after George Sodder came awake to the sight of his house burning, is a sequence of events that he described and redescribed over the following years and decades, with a consistency that reflects either the precision of an accurate memory or the precision of a story that has been told so many times it has become fixed, and that in either case contains, within its specific details, the elements that would make the case what it became. He called out. He woke Jennie. They moved through the house in the specific urgency of parents in a burning building who know that their children are upstairs, calling names, calling to the children to wake up, to get out, to come down. John, who was 23 and sleeping on the ground floor, made it out. Marion and George Jr. came downstairs in the chaos of the moment. Jennie carried 2-year-old Sylvia, and George, understanding that 5 children were still upstairs, did what any father would do, which was to try to go back in and get them. He could not get in. He could not get back into the burning house. The smoke was already thick in the stairwell, and the fire, by accounts from various witnesses who would later describe what they saw when they arrived on the scene, was spreading through the structure with a speed that was unusual, and that several people noted as not consistent with the ordinary behavior of a house fire that had simply started and built in the usual way. George went around the outside of the house. He tried to climb through a window. He tried to find his ladder, the ladder he was certain he had left leaning against the side of the house, the ladder he had used only days before and had left in a specific location against the exterior wall in a way that he was entirely sure of. The ladder was not there. He tried to reach his truck, to use its headlights to illuminate the front of the house, to do something that might help him reach his children. The truck would not start. This would later be noted as one of the case's strangest details, because in the days following the fire, the same truck started without difficulty, and the trucks belonging to neighbors, called to the scene in those terrible minutes, started and worked without issue. What had been wrong with the truck on the one night that starting it mattered most was never explained. He tried to climb a sycamore tree near the house, to get to the level of the upstairs windows, to reach the children from the outside by whatever route was available. The fire was moving too fast. A woman who lived nearby, a Mrs. Georgiana Kinney, was awakened by the fire and came out of her house and watched, and later said that she had seen what she took to be the children looking out of an upstairs window before they disappeared from view. Whether she was correct in what she saw, whether what she saw was the children or something else, whether the window she described was one from which escape would have been possible, are questions that the investigation of the following days and weeks did not adequately answer. Jennie Sodder, in those first minutes after the alarm was raised, tried to call the fire department. Telephone did not work. She ran to a neighbor's house and used the phone there, and the fire department was notified, and this is where a detail enters the story that would take on increasing weight in the years that followed. The fire department did not arrive until morning, not until 8 o'clock in the morning, according to the accounts given by the family and by neighbors, which means that the house burned for somewhere between 6 and 7 hours before the people who were equipped to do anything about it appeared at the scene. The fire chief at the time, a man named F.J. Maurice, had his own explanation for the delay, which was disputed by the family and which the community never fully accepted. By the time firefighters arrived, there was nothing left of the house but smoldering ash and the remnants of the foundation. And in that ash, when the ruins cooled enough for anyone to search them, there were no remains, no bones, no physical evidence that 5 children had been in the house when it burned. The ash was searched, in the days after the fire, in a manner that the family would later describe as cursory and inadequate, and what it yielded was nothing that could be definitively identified as human. This was the fact on which everything else in the Sodder case would turn. Everything that followed, every investigation, and every theory, and every letter, and every photograph, and every decade of grief, was an elaboration on this single central absence, the absence of the children's remains from the ash of the house. The official response, in the immediate aftermath of the fire, was to declare the 5 missing children dead. The local coroner conducted a brief examination of the scene and reached a conclusion that was both legally convenient and emotionally devastating. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie Jr., and Betty Sodder had died in the fire. The coroner's investigation lasted, by various accounts, no more than 30 minutes. There was no formal forensic analysis. There was no consultation with specialists in fire investigation or with forensic pathologists equipped to assess what the physical evidence at the scene actually meant. There was an official determination, and the determination was that the children had perished, and the official record was closed. George and Jennie Sodder did not close theirs. They could not, because the conclusion that the official record had reached required accepting something that George, who had spent those terrible minutes outside the house trying to reach his children, could not accept. He knew how houses burned. He knew what fires did and did not do. He knew that human beings, even children, even small children, leave something behind when they die in fires. That bone does not simply vanish in the way that the official explanation required the children's bodies to have vanished in order for the investigation's conclusion to be correct. He knew that the lather had been there. He knew that his truck had not started. He knew that the fire had moved in a way that he did not understand, and that the people who had explained it to him had not explained well. He knew about the threats. In the months before the fire, George Sodder had been engaged in the kind of conversation about Italian politics that was, in the Italian immigrant communities of that period, a matter of genuine urgency and genuine danger. Mussolini's Italy had divided those communities sharply between those who supported the fascist regime, with a pride rooted in the specific form of Italian nationalism that fascism cultivated, and those who opposed it, who recognized in fascism something that they had come to America specifically to escape, a system of enforced conformity and political violence that was antithetical to everything that the American experiment, as they understood it, represented. George Sodder was among the latter. He had said publicly what he thought about Mussolini, about the regime, about what it represented for Italy and for Italians everywhere. He had said it in the way that people say things in small communities, in the barber shop and the tavern, and at community gatherings, without particular calculation about who was listening. Someone had been listening who did not appreciate what he heard. In the months before the fire, George had received what he understood as a threat. An Italian man, a stranger to him, had come to his property and said things that George later described as amounting to a warning, to a threat against his house and his family connected to his political statements. The accounts of what was actually said and who the man was have varied somewhat across the tellings, but the core of it is consistent. George Sodder had been warned, in terms he took seriously enough to remember, that his family was at risk from people who disapproved of what he had said and who had the means to do something about it. He had not, as far as the record shows, reported this threat to law enforcement before the fire. He had perhaps not believed it would be acted on in the specific, catastrophic way it might have been. He had perhaps not known what to do with a threat that was vague enough to be denied and specific enough to be frightening. And when the fire came, and the children were gone, and the official investigation produced an explanation that he did not believe, the threat came back to him with the full weight of retrospect, as the thing that explained what he could not otherwise explain, as the mechanism by which the fire had been caused, and the children had been taken, rather than destroyed. There was something else. There had been, in the period before the fire, a man who came to the Sodder property in the capacity of an insurance salesman, offering a policy that George had declined to purchase. The account of this encounter that George later gave described the insurance salesman as leaving with language that constituted, in George's memory, something between a warning and a prediction. He had said something to the effect that the house was going to burn down, that George was going to die, that the family was in danger. Whether this was the same individual as the one who had spoken about George's political statements, or a different person, or whether George's memory of two separate encounters had in some subsequent telling conflated them into one, has never been established. But the existence of this encounter, or these encounters, with individuals who seemed to carry a foreknowledge of what was going to happen to the Sodder house, was part of the case that George built, over the following years, for the proposition that the fire had not been accidental. The telephone line was not cut during the fire. It was cut before. This detail, established by the telephone company linesman, who later examined the line, meant that the Sodders' ability to call for help had been removed before the fire began, which meant that someone who knew the fire was going to start had wanted to limit the family's ability to respond to it. The linesman described the cut as deliberate and clean, not the damage that a fire might have caused, but the deliberate severing of a line by someone who had done it intentionally. This was the kind of evidence that, in a properly conducted investigation, would have changed the character of the inquiry from fire investigation to criminal investigation. In the investigation of the Sodder fire, it was noted, and apparently not pursued with the urgency it warranted. The circumstances of the fire itself continued to trouble everyone who examined them with any care. The house had been modern enough, by the standards of rural West Virginia in 1945, to have been wired for electricity and to have had a fuse box and the infrastructure that residential electricity required. The fire, when it started, appeared to have begun in a location near or associated with the electrical system, and the rate at which it spread through the structure was noted by witnesses as unusually rapid, the kind of speed that is more consistent with the introduction of accelerant than with an ordinary electrical fire building from a slow start. George himself had observed from outside the burning house that the fire seemed to move in a way that was not the ordinary progression he would have expected, that it engulfed the structure with a thoroughness and a speed that suggested something beyond a simple accidental origin. The fire department's failure to respond in anything resembling a timely manner remains one of the case's least explained elements. Fire Chief Maurice's account of the delay has never satisfied the family or the community, and the specific reasons for it have never been conclusively established. What is established is that the house burned to its foundation during those 6 or 7 hours, without any suppression effort by the people whose job it was to provide one, and that by the time they arrived, the possibility of searching the ruins while they were still hot and potentially yielding evidence had passed. So the delay was negligence, malfunction, or something more deliberate has been debated for decades without resolution. The absence of human remains is the fact around which all other facts orbit. The official position, articulated in the immediate aftermath and maintained by those who accepted the coroner's determination, was that the fire had burned so hot and so thoroughly that the children's remains had been essentially incinerated, reduced to ash, indistinguishable from the other ash of the house. This explanation has been evaluated by fire investigators and forensic pathologists who have commented on the case over the decades since, and the consensus among those with expertise is that it is not consistent with what we know about the behavior of fire on human bone. Human bone is extraordinarily resistant to fire, even in cremation, a process specifically engineered to apply maximum heat for maximum duration to a human body. Significant quantities of bone fragments remain. The idea that 5 children, including teenagers whose bones would have been well developed, could have been entirely consumed without leaving any identifiable skeletal fragments in a house fire, however hot and however prolonged, is not supported by the science of what fires actually do. George Sodder understood this intuitively, from the practical knowledge of a man who had seen fires and knew what they left behind. He may not have had the technical vocabulary of forensic pathology, but he had the common sense of a man who knew that bones do not simply disappear, and the official explanation asked him to accept that they had. He would not accept it. In the days and weeks after the fire, witnesses began to come forward with accounts that complicated the official narrative in the specific way that witness testimony always complicates investigations that have been too quickly closed. A woman named Mrs. Ida Crutchfield, who operated a motel in Lewisburg, approximately 40 miles from Fayetteville, came forward to say that on the night of the fire she had seen a car stop at her motel in the early morning hours, and that she had observed in that car several children who appeared frightened and distressed, who she estimated were in the age range of the missing Sodder children, and who were accompanied by adults she did not recognize. She had not known at the time that there was a fire in Fayetteville or that children were missing. She came forward when she heard the news, because what she had seen seemed to her, in retrospect, to bear some relationship to the children who had disappeared. Another witness, a woman named Mrs. Ida Crutchfield, had seen something similar. Multiple accounts converge on the observation that children matching the description of the missing Sodders were seen in a passing car on the road in the vicinity of Fayetteville on the night of the fire. seen by people who did not know at the time that children were missing from a burning house nearby, seen in the specific context of late-night car travel that would have been unremarkable in any other circumstance, and became remarkable only after the knowledge of what had happened to the Sodder family spread through the region in the days that followed. The testimony of these witnesses was not adequately investigated. It was noted, in the way that inconvenient evidence is sometimes noted by investigations that have already reached their preferred conclusion, and it was set aside. The family was not satisfied that it had been adequately followed up. They were not satisfied about any of it, and they responded in the way that people respond when the official processes have failed them, and they have the resources and the determination to pursue the matter themselves. They hired a private investigator. The first investigator they hired, a man from Cincinnati, went to Charleston, West Virginia, following a lead that the family believed might connect to the whereabouts of the children, and was never heard from again. His disappearance was reported. It was not, as far as the historical record shows, investigated with any great urgency. A private investigator pursuing a lead in a case that the official record had closed, going missing in the process, produced no particular institutional response. He simply was gone, which added to the accumulation of things associated with this case that had simply gone. The family continued. They hired other investigators. They followed other leads. They placed advertisements in newspapers asking for information about the children. They contacted Italian immigrant communities across the country, based on George's belief that the fire and the disappearance were connected to the Italian political world and to the individuals who had threatened him, that his children might be alive somewhere in the network of Italian-American communities that stretched across the eastern United States. They received responses. Some of them were obviously untrustworthy. Some of them were specific enough and came from sources credible enough to keep the hope alive, or at least to keep the uncertainty alive, which is not the same thing as hope, but is, in the specific context of the Sodder case, what kept George and Jennie searching for as long as they searched. And then there was the billboard. George Sodder, at some point in the years after the fire, made a decision that was itself a kind of statement, a declaration that the case was not closed as far as his family was concerned, and that the world was going to be reminded of that fact on a continuing basis, whether it wanted to be or not. He erected a billboard on Route 16, one of the main roads through Fayetteville, a large display that bore the photographs of all 5 missing children, alongside a description of what had happened on Christmas Eve of 1945, and a request for information. The billboard stood for 40 years. It was maintained by the family through all of those years, kept current, kept visible, standing at the edge of a road that millions of people traveled in the decades of its existence. It became, over time, one of the most distinctive and most unsettling features of that particular stretch of West Virginia highway, a permanent advertisement for an unresolved grief, a reminder to everyone who drove past it that somewhere, under some other name and some other life, 5 children might be alive who had gone missing on a Christmas Eve in 1945. George died in 1969, 24 years after the fire. He had spent those 24 years searching, advocating, refusing to accept the official conclusion, and living in the specific sustained pain of a man who cannot grieve his children properly because he does not know whether they are dead. He did not find them. He did not receive the answer he was looking for. He died, by his daughter Sylvia's account, still believing that his children had been taken alive, still convinced that the fire had been set deliberately by people who had threatened him, still certain that the absence of remains in the ash meant that the children had survived the night and were somewhere in the world where he had been unable to find them. He spent 24 years in that certainty, or that hope, or that agonizing space between certainty and hope, where he had lived since December 24th, 1945. And then he was gone, and Jennie was left to continue alone. Jennie Sodder continued the search. She continued the billboard. She continued to maintain the family's position, to speak with investigators and journalists and curious members of the public who reached out over the years with information or theories or simply the human need to engage with a mystery that the passage of time had made famous rather than settled. She lived for 20 years after George died, and she spent those 20 years as he had spent his, in the specific mode of a mother who had lost 5 children and had never been able to bury them, had never been able to stand at a grave, had never been given the thing that grief requires to settle into itself and become something that can be carried rather than something that must be constantly fought. She died in 1989, 44 years after the fire. She had spent those 44 years, as her husband had spent his 24, in the sustained uncertainty that makes this case different in kind from most cases of family tragedy, however terrible. Most parents who lose children lose them in a way that, however devastating, produces a knowledge. They know what happened. They know where the children are. They carry the weight of that knowledge for the rest of their lives, and it is an enormous weight. But it has a shape. It has boundaries. It is a known thing rather than an unknown one. George and Jennie Sodder never had that. They had the fire, and the ash, and the absence of any physical evidence of their children's deaths, and the witnesses who had seen children in cars on the night of the fire, and the threats that had been made in the months before it, and the ladder that was missing, and the truck that would not start, and the telephone line that had been cut. And they had 44 and 24 years respectively of living in the knowledge that they did not know, that they had never known, that the thing they most needed to know had been denied to them by the inadequacy of the investigation that should have found it. The billboard came down after Jennie died. Sylvia, the youngest Sodder child, the 2-year-old who had been carried out of the burning house in her mother's arms on Christmas Eve of 1945, and who had therefore survived in a way that her 5 siblings may or may not have survived, took down the billboard and buried the items her parents had kept over the decades of their search, the letters and the photographs and the documents, in a sealed box on a hillside that she has not identified publicly. She was honoring, in this act of burial, the grief of parents who had been denied a burial for 44 years, giving the search itself a resting place even in the absence of the thing the search had been looking for. But before she did that, in 1989, she gave a final interview that has become one of the most watched and most discussed accounts of the case in its modern iteration. An interview in which she described her experience of growing up as the sibling of 5 missing children, as the child who got out, as the survivor of a night that had been the defining event of her family's life, and that had shaped everything about the world she had grown up in. She described parents who were consumed by the search, not in a way that left their surviving children neglected, but in a way that made the search a permanent feature of the household, a constant presence, a thing that was always ongoing, even when it produced nothing new to pursue. She described the billboard. She described the investigators. She described the letters. And she described the photograph. In 1967, 22 years after the fire, the Sodder family received an anonymous letter. It arrived without a return address. Inside it was a photograph. The photograph showed a young man. He was, the family estimated, roughly in his early to mid-20s, which would have been consistent with the age that Louis Sodder, who had been 9 years old in 1945, would have reached by 1967. He bore a resemblance to the family. He had features that they recognized as similar to the features they remembered in Louis, and that were visible in the photographs they had of Louis as a child. The letter that accompanied the photograph contained, by various accounts, language suggesting that it was from someone who knew Louis, or someone who was connected to the Sodder family's situation, or perhaps even from Louis himself, though the specific wording has been described in slightly different ways by different sources across the years. The back of the photograph was marked with writing. The writing identified the individual in the image as Louis Sodder, or as connected to Louis Sodder, and included language that suggested there were other Sodder children who were alive. One account of the writing on the photograph reads, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Louis, one of the 4 Sodder children." The phrasing is specific in its way, one of 4, suggesting that the person who sent the photograph was accounting for the 5 missing children by subtracting 1, perhaps themselves, perhaps the photographer, suggesting that the remaining Sodder children numbered 4 and that they were alive. The family took the photograph to investigators. Nothing came of it. The photograph could not be definitively connected to Louis Sodder. The handwriting on the back was not identified. The origin of the letter was not traced. The young man in the photograph was not found and identified. What remained was the image itself, a face that the Sodder family believed they recognized, a face that carried in its features, to the eyes of a family that had spent 22 years looking at the photographs of the children they had lost, the specific resemblance of a person who might be someone they had known. Whether the photograph was genuine evidence that Louis Sodder had survived and grown into the young man whose face it contained, or whether it was something else entirely, an elaborate hoax perpetrated by someone who had followed the case and understood its emotional geography, or a genuine but mistaken identification by a well-meaning person who had encountered someone who resembled the famous missing children, is a question that has never been answered. The photograph exists in the record of the case. The question it raises has never been resolved. It is one of several specific pieces of evidence that the formal investigation, which ended far too early, never had the opportunity to pursue. There was also the matter of the fire chief's discovery in the ashes. In the months following the fire, F.J. Maurice, the fire chief whose department had failed to respond for 6 or 7 hours while the house burned, announced that he had found, in the ash and debris of the ruins, a human heart. He stated that this discovery represented physical evidence that the children had indeed died in the fire, that here was the physical proof that the official determination had been correct. The heart was taken to a pathologist for examination. The pathologist's findings were not what Maurice had presented. The pathologist determined that what Maurice had presented as a human heart was in fact beef liver, or an organ of similar character, and crucially, that it had not been exposed to fire. It was intact. It was not burned. Whatever it was, and wherever it had come from, it had not been in the fire that had consumed the Sodder house. The implications of this were not pursued by the investigation in the way they should have been. The most charitable interpretation was that Maurice had made a genuine error in identification and that the discovery was simply an unfortunate mistake. The less charitable interpretation, the one that the Sodder family and many subsequent investigators have applied, was that the heart had been planted in the ruins after the fact by someone who wanted to close the case, who wanted to produce the physical evidence of the children's deaths that the fire itself had not provided, who understood that without some physical evidence, the official conclusion of death could not be maintained against the family's sustained challenge. The fire chief who planted a beef liver in the ash of a burned house to close an investigation is a figure of considerable moral and legal significance. Whether that is what happened at the Sodder property in Fayetteville in 1946 has never been established. The theories that have been advanced over the decades to explain the Sodder case fall broadly into 2 categories, though within each category there are variations of emphasis and detail that reflect the specific preoccupations of the individuals who have developed them. The first category is the theory of accidental death with poor investigation, the position that the 5 children did die in the fire of December 24, 1945, that their deaths were the tragic but not mysterious consequence of a rapidly spreading fire in a pre-dawn house from which they were unable to escape, and that the absence of their remains in the ash is explained by a fire hot enough and prolonged enough to have destroyed what should have been there, combined with an investigation that was conducted with insufficient care and rigor to find whatever remnants might have survived. This theory requires accepting that the fire's temperature was sufficient to do what fire experts say it is unlikely to have done, and it requires accepting a number of the suspicious details surrounding the fire as coincidences, as unrelated anomalies that contributed to the appearance of something sinister without actually constituting evidence of it. The second category is the theory of deliberate arson and kidnapping, the theory that the fire was set intentionally, that the children were removed from the house before or during the fire, that they were taken somewhere and raised under different names and different identities, and that the fire was a cover for this removal, an attempt to make 5 children disappear in a way that the world would accept as death. Within this theory, the questions are about who set the fire and took the children, and why, and what happened to the children afterward. The most developed version of this theory, and the one most closely connected to what George Sodder believed for the rest of his life, connects the arson and the kidnapping to the Italian political networks, to the people who had threatened George for his public opposition to Mussolini, to the specific world of Italian immigrant politics, in which a man who said the wrong things about the wrong people could find himself the subject of a response that was not limited to argument. The mafia theory, as it has sometimes been called, or the organized crime theory more broadly, posits that George's public statements about Mussolini and Italian fascism had made him an enemy of organized elements within the Italian immigrant community whose interests were aligned with the fascist regime, and that those elements had the capacity and the motivation to orchestrate something as elaborate as a kidnapping, concealed as a fire death. This theory is not inherently implausible. The Italian-American Mafia was, by 1945, a genuine and powerful criminal organization with presence across the eastern United States and with connections to Italian political networks that extended back to the fascist period. The idea that an organization with those capabilities could organize the taking of 5 children from a burning house and arrange for their concealment across the country is not outside the range of what such an organization could do. What is harder to establish is why. Why would any organized crime group, however offended by George Sodder's political opinions, take 5 children rather than simply killing George himself, which would have been considerably simpler and considerably less logistically demanding? The theory's advocates have offered various explanations for this choice, including the possibility that taking the children and letting George and Jennie live to grieve and search was itself a form of punishment more complete and more lasting than a killing would have been. That the sustained, decades-long agony of the Sodder parents was not a consequence of the plan, but was the plan. There is a darkness to this interpretation that is difficult to fully contemplate. The idea that 5 children were taken from their parents as an act of deliberate cruelty designed to produce a lifetime of grief in the parents, rather than as an unintended consequence of some other goal, places the case in a category of human behavior that most people would rather not acknowledge as belonging to the world in which ordinary families live. The children, if they survived, were taken somewhere. They were given names. They were given lives, whether they were raised in the knowledge of who they were and what had happened to them, or whether they were raised in ignorance of it, raised to believe they were the children of whoever had taken them, raised in the specific oblivion of people who do not know that their identities are not their own, is one of the questions that the theory raises and cannot answer. If they grew up knowing who they were, then the silence they maintained across the decades of the billboard and the newspaper advertisements and the private investigators and the letters was a deliberate choice, an act of concealment, sustained across years and perhaps across generations. If they grew up not knowing, then the photograph of the young man who resembled Louis Sodder might represent someone who had no idea, when his photograph was taken and sent to an address he did not recognize, what his own story actually was. The case has attracted sustained attention from amateur investigators and true crime researchers in the decades since it first became widely known through newspaper coverage and later through internet discussion and documentary treatment. A number of specific details have been repeatedly examined by this research community with the tools available to people working outside a formal investigative context, and some of those examinations have produced observations that the formal investigation never made. The speed of the fire, for example, has been analyzed by people with backgrounds in fire investigation who have argued that the rate of spread described by witnesses is more consistent with the use of accelerant than with an accidental electrical fire. The phone line that was cut before the fire started has been analyzed in the context of what it would mean to cut a phone line before starting a fire at a house you had not yet set on fire, since the line would only need to be cut before the fire if someone knew the fire was going to start before it started. The missing ladder has been analyzed as a logistical necessity for someone who needed to reach the upper floor of the house before or during the fire, who needed the ladder for their own purposes, and therefore removed it from its position against the wall. These observations, individually, can each be rebutted by someone determined to rebut them. Taken together, they constitute a pattern that the formal investigation of December 1945 and the months that followed did not take seriously, and that the absence of an adequate formal investigation has left without the kind of definitive resolution that only a properly resourced criminal inquiry could produce. The survivors of the Sodder family, the children who came out of the burning house on Christmas Eve of 1945, have lived their entire lives in the specific shadow of the case. Sylvia, the youngest, who was only 2 on the night of the fire and who has therefore no personal memory of it, has been the most public of the surviving siblings in maintaining the family's story and the family's position. She has given interviews across the decades. She has engaged with researchers. She has maintained the position that her parents maintained, that the official conclusion was wrong, that the children were taken rather than killed, that somewhere in the years between 1945 and the deaths of George in 1969 and Jennie in 1989, the truth was available to be found and was not found. She has lived her adult life as the sibling of 5 people who are either her dead brothers and sisters or her living brothers and sisters somewhere in the world, and the inability to resolve which of those things is true has been the defining fact of her relationship to her own family history. To lose a sibling is one kind of grief. To lose 5 siblings simultaneously, in a fire that began while they were asleep on Christmas Eve, would be a grief of its own magnitude, enormous and specific, and shaped by all the particular details of the loss. But to lose 5 siblings, and then to spend decades in the uncertainty of whether they were actually lost, whether you were grieving people who were dead or people who were alive somewhere and for some reason unreachable, is something else again, a kind of sustained psychological difficulty that does not resolve in the ordinary way of grief, that does not pass through the stages that grief is supposed to pass through, because it never reaches the certainty that grief requires as its foundation. George Sodder erected the billboard because he could not accept that his children were dead. But the billboard was also evidence of something else, of a specific kind of desperation, the desperation of a parent who understands that the official channels have failed and that the only remaining tool is publicity, is the simple act of putting the faces of the missing in front of the maximum possible number of people and hoping that someone who knows something will see them and respond. The billboard stood for 40 years. It is difficult to calculate how many people drove past it in those 40 years, how many people looked at the photographs of 5 children and the information about what had happened to them and drove on, or pulled over, or thought about what they knew and didn't know, or simply registered it as one more piece of the visual landscape of a highway that had been traveled enough times that it no longer fully commanded attention. In those 40 years, the responses came. Some of them were obviously useless. Some of them were the product of people who wanted to help but had nothing specific to offer. Some of them were specific enough to warrant follow-up, and were followed up without producing the identification that would have changed everything. The letter in 1967 with the photograph was the most specific thing the family received, the most concrete potential connection to the children's actual whereabouts that the decades of searching produced. And it, too, was ultimately inconclusive. It, too, remained in the family of evidence that pointed toward something without establishing it. The case has never been officially reopened. The official determination that the 5 Sodder children died in the fire of December 24, 1945, has never been reversed by any court or any agency. The deaths are on the books. The record says what the record said in 1946, and the record has not been amended by the evidence that the family assembled over the following decades, evidence that was never formally reviewed and formally evaluated by the people with the authority to change the record. George and Jennie Sodder spent their lives trying to change a record that the institutions which created it had no motivation to revisit. This is one of the case's specific injustices, and it is an injustice that exists independently of whether the children died or survived, because in either case, the investigation of December 1945 was inadequate to the facts. If the children died, the investigation failed to establish that in the only way that would have been conclusive, through the recovery and identification of physical remains. If the children survived, the investigation failed to recognize the evidence that they had survived and to pursue it with the urgency that the survival of 5 kidnapped children would have warranted. In either case, the investigation that was actually conducted fell so far below the standard that the evidence required that it produced, rather than certainty, only the appearance of certainty, an official conclusion resting on a foundation of insufficient investigation that looked like resolution while leaving everything actually unresolved. This is what the case is, finally. Not a mystery in the sense of an entertaining puzzle with a solution waiting to be discovered. Not a conspiracy theory requiring elaborate architecture to sustain. A case of institutional failure in the investigation of a catastrophic event. A failure that produced an official record stating that 5 children died, in the absence of the physical evidence that would have been required to support that statement if the investigation had been conducted with the rigor it demanded. And that left, as the consequence of that failure, a family of 2 parents and 5 surviving children, living for the rest of their natural lives in the permanent, unresolvable uncertainty of not knowing what had actually happened. George and Jennie Sodder are buried in West Virginia. Their 5 missing children are either buried nowhere because their remains were never found, or buried somewhere else under names that are not their own. The truth of which of these things is the case has been sought across 8 decades without being found, by family members and investigators and journalists and amateur researchers and everyone else who has been touched by the specific horror of this particular story, and it has not been found, and nothing in the current record of the case suggests that it is about to be found. What it means to lose 5 children in a single night and not know, for the rest of your life, whether you are grieving them or searching for them, whether they are dead or alive in the world somewhere, whether the face in a photograph, received in the mail 22 years after their disappearance, is the face of your son, grown into a man you would not have recognized without the specific knowledge of who he was, is not something that language adequately covers. It is not something that the vocabulary of grief covers, because grief, as ordinarily understood, has an object, something that is known to be gone, and the Sodder case denied its survivors the object by denying them the knowledge. It is not something that the vocabulary of hope covers, because hope implies a positive belief in a particular outcome, and what George and Jennie lived in was not hope in that sense, but something more like the prevention of closure, the sustained impossibility of arriving at a settled relationship with what had happened, because what had happened could not be established. There is a word, sometimes used in these contexts, ambiguous loss, coined by the psychologist Pauline Boss, to describe the specific category of grief that occurs when a loss cannot be clearly defined or confirmed, when the person who is lost is physically absent but psychologically present, or physically present but psychologically absent. It is a concept developed partly in response to the specific experiences of families of missing persons, of people with dementia, of prisoners of war and their families, of everyone who has had to inhabit the particular psychological space of not knowing whether the person they love is alive or dead. George and Jennie Sodder lived in that space for the rest of their lives. They lived in it, not for a year or two, but for decades, across the normal span of what a human life contains, across the years of work and age, and the deaths of people they had known, across every Christmas Eve from 1945 onward, each one a repetition of the date on which the loss had occurred, each one a reminder that the question had still not been answered. The billboard is down. The box is buried. George and Jennie are gone. Sylvia, who was 2 years old on Christmas Eve of 1945, and who has carried the case through her adult life, is the last of that original family, with a living memory of what the night was like before the fire started, the last person who was present in that house on that evening, and who has lived to speak about it. The question that the night left behind her has not been answered. It is still there, in the record of the case and in the specific absence of what the case required to be resolved, in the space where 5 children's remains should be and are not, in the photograph of a young man that may or may not be the face of Louis Sodder at 26, in the words on the back of that photograph that counted the living Sodder children as 4 and implied that the sender was one of them. The night of December 24th, 1945, started as a Christmas Eve and became something else, became the first night of a loss that was never settled into certainty, never given the shape that loss requires to be carried through a life, rather than simply dragging behind you as an unresolved wound. That is the Sodder case. That is what it is, and what it has always been. Not a murder, not a tragedy of known proportions, but the specific and irreversible consequence of an inadequate investigation and a set of suspicious circumstances that were never fully explained, of a fire that may have been set and children who may have been taken, of a family that refused to accept the official conclusion and spent 44 years and 24 years respectively in the act of refusing it, and were not rewarded for that refusal with the truth, and died without it. 5 children, 1 night, 44 years of a mother's searching, 24 years of a father's, and at the end of all of it, the same question that was there at the beginning, still unanswered, still unanswerable by the available evidence, still the thing that the Sodder case presents to anyone who looks at it directly and honestly and without the comfort of a conclusion that the facts do not support. Where are the children? The fire is cold. The ash is gone. The billboard is down. George and Jennie are buried. And the answer, if there is one, is somewhere in the world, or beneath it. To sit properly with the Sodder case, to hold it with the weight it deserves, it is necessary to spend time with the specific texture of the life that George and Jennie were living in Fayetteville in 1945, and with the specific texture of the lives they were living in the years that preceded the fire. Because the fire did not happen in a vacuum, and the people it happened to were not simply generic figures of parental love and loss, but specific human beings, embedded in a specific community, in a specific historical moment, and the specificity matters for understanding both what happened and why it was handled the way it was. George Sodder had come to West Virginia in the first decades of the 20th century and had built, through the years of the Depression and the war and the slow, hard work of establishing himself in a new country and a new community, something that he had not been born to and could not have been given, something that required of him the specific combination of labor and intelligence and social skill that immigrants to this country have always had to deploy more deliberately and more consciously than those who were born here. He ran a trucking business that was successful enough to support a family of 12, which is a considerable achievement in any era, and more considerable in the era of the Depression and the war and the specific economic conditions of rural West Virginia. He owned his house. He was known in Fayetteville, recognized, regarded, the kind of man who has earned his place in a community through the sustained demonstration of reliability and capability. He was also Italian, which in Fayetteville, West Virginia, in the 1940s, was not a neutral identity. Italian immigrants occupied a complex position in the racial and ethnic taxonomy of mid-century American society, considered white, and therefore within the scope of the legal protections and social possibilities available to white Americans, but also distinctly ethnic, distinctly foreign in their cultural references and sometimes in their language and their family structures, subject to the specific suspicions and stereotypes that American nativism attached to Southern European immigrants in particular, including the suspicion, widespread in the culture of that period, of criminal connections, of mafia involvement, of a cultural alignment with violence and lawlessness that was not evidence-based but was pervasive. George Sodder was not a criminal and had no mafia connections, but he was Italian, and Italian immigrants of his generation understood very well that the assumption of such connections could be made by the people around them, regardless of the actual facts of their lives. His political opinions added another layer to this complexity. Italian immigrants in America in the years of Mussolini's regime were, as a community, divided in their response to the fascist government of their home country. And this division was not merely theoretical. It produced real social conflict within Italian-American communities, conflict between those who supported the regime and those who opposed it, conflict that in some cases involved intimidation and threats, and the specific violence that political disagreements produce in communities where the stakes feel existential and where the instruments of formal justice are not uniformly available to everyone involved. George Sodder's public statements about Mussolini had made him a figure in this conflict, on the side that opposed the regime, and the man who came to his property and threatened him in the months before the fire was, by his own account, part of the network of Italian Americans who supported fascism and who dealt with opposition in the methods available to them. Whether the threat was a real statement of intent backed by the capacity to carry it out, or whether it was an expression of frustration and hostility that was never meant to be enacted, or whether it was something in between, a warning issued by someone who genuinely believed George was creating trouble for himself without having a specific plan to create the trouble for him, was something that George did not know and that the investigation of the fire never attempted to establish. The historical context of the fire in December 1945 is also worth attending to. The war had ended 4 months earlier, in August and September of 1945, and the country was in the specific dislocated moment of transition that follows a war, adjusting to the cessation of the specific conditions the war had created and to the return of the conditions that preceded it, the social arrangements and the political tensions and the ordinary dynamics of civilian life that the war had interrupted and that were now reasserting themselves in communities across the country. Italian Americans were in a particular position in this transition because Italy had been an enemy in the war, and the divided loyalties of Italian American communities during the war had been a source of genuine suspicion and conflict in many places, and the specific political tensions within those communities had, in some cases, produced exactly the kind of personal grievance and personal threat that George described. The fire of December 24th, 1945, occurred in this context, and the context is part of the case, part of what makes the suspicious elements of the fire more than coincidence and more than paranoia. A man who had been threatened by organized elements within his own ethnic community, who had been warned that his house would burn and his family would be harmed, whose house then burned under suspicious circumstances with suspicious speed, while his telephone was cut and his ladder was missing and his truck would not start, is a man whose suspicions deserve to be taken seriously by any investigation that approaches the evidence honestly. The investigation of December 1945 did not approach the evidence honestly, not because the investigators were necessarily corrupt or complicit in whatever had happened, but because the investigation was conducted in a way that prioritized reaching a conclusion over establishing the truth. The coroner's 30-minute examination of the ruins, the failure to consult specialists in fire investigation or forensic pathology, the failure to pursue the witness accounts of children seen in a car on the night of the fire, the failure to follow up adequately on the cut telephone line, the failure to investigate the missing ladder, the failure to adequately document and analyze the absence of human remains. Each of these failures, taken individually, might be attributed to the limitations of a small-town investigation in 1945, to the resources available and the expertise at hand, and the procedures that existed in that era for the investigation of fires and of missing persons cases. Taken together, they constitute a pattern of insufficient investigation that prevented the establishment of the truth in a case where the truth was both findable and necessary. The specific failure that haunts the case most persistently is the failure to adequately search the ruins. The family and various researchers who have examined the case have noted that a proper forensic investigation of a burned structure in which 5 people are believed to have died would require a systematic and thorough examination of the debris, the recovery, and careful examination of every piece of potentially significant material, the consultation of forensic specialists who could assess whether what was recovered was consistent with human remains or the absence of human remains. This was not done. The investigation that was done was not designed to find the truth, but to confirm a conclusion that had already been reached, and it succeeded at that narrower task while failing at the only task that actually mattered. The fire itself deserves more attention than it typically receives in summaries of the case. The house on the night of December 24, 1945, was a wooden structure typical of residential construction in West Virginia in that era, frame construction, probably with some plaster interior walls, heated by a furnace or by individual heating units. Such a house, set on fire by whatever means, would burn. The question is how it burned, specifically, how it burned so completely and so quickly that by the time the fire department arrived in the morning, there was nothing left but ash and foundation remnants, and the question of whether ordinary fire behavior explains this or whether something had been done to the house to ensure that it would burn in exactly this way. People who have investigated fires professionally, who have spent careers understanding what fires do and what they leave behind, have looked at the Sodder case and offered observations about it that the original investigation never had the opportunity to make. The rate of spread, the completeness of combustion, the specific absence of the structural elements that typically survive even serious house fires. The observations are not unanimous in their conclusions, and the absence of the actual site and the actual physical evidence from 1945 means that forensic analysis, 80 years later, operates on incomplete information. but the observations are consistent enough in their direction to support what George Sodder believed, which is that whatever happened to that house on December 24, 1945, was not a simple accidental fire that happened to reach an unusual intensity. The latter matters more than it might initially seem to matter. George Sodder had left a ladder leaning against the exterior of the house. It was a ladder of sufficient length to reach the upper story, where the 5 missing children were sleeping. George knew where it was. He had used it recently. He went to find it when he understood that he needed to reach the upper floor, and it was not there. The ladder's absence in the moments after George realized his children were trapped upstairs is the single clearest piece of evidence that someone had been on or around the property before the fire started, that someone had known the ladder was there and removed it, specifically to prevent what George was trying to do, specifically to ensure that the upper floor would be inaccessible from outside. The alternative explanation, that the ladder had simply been moved or taken by someone for innocent reasons before the fire, that its absence on that specific night was coincidence, is theoretically possible. Most things that happen are theoretically possible to explain as coincidence. The accumulated weight of the coincidences in the Sodder case is the reason that the coincidence explanation is difficult to sustain across all of them together, because each additional coincidence that must be invoked to explain each additional suspicious detail diminishes the plausibility of the coincidence explanation and increases the plausibility that something more intentional was going on. The truck that would not start, the telephone line that was cut, the missing ladder, the fire that moved with unusual speed, the fire department that did not respond for 6 or 7 hours, the beef liver planted in the ash, the witnesses who saw children in a car on the night of the fire, the private investigator who disappeared. The photograph received 22 years later. Each of these, on its own, can be explained. None of them, on its own, is proof of anything. Together, they describe a specific shape of events that is more consistent with deliberate action than with accident, and the investigation of December 1945 never engaged seriously with that shape. George Sodder filed reports and made complaints and pushed at the official record for 24 years and received, for those 24 years, responses that ranged from dismissal to indifference to the occasional expression of sympathy that was not accompanied by action. He was not a man without resources, not a man without standing in his community. He was a successful businessman, a property owner, a man with 5 surviving children and a wife, and the kind of community presence that comes from decades of living and working in the same small city. And despite all of that, he could not move the official record. He could not force an investigation that the people in charge of investigations had decided was not needed. He could not make the death certificates reflect the uncertainty that the evidence warranted. He spent 24 years pushing against a wall that would not move, and then he died, and Jennie pushed against it for 20 more years, and then she died, and the wall is still there. This is one of the things the Sodder case reveals that extends beyond the specific circumstances of one family in West Virginia in 1945. It reveals the specific way that official conclusions, once reached, resist revision even when the evidence that supports them is inadequate and the evidence against them is substantial. The official determination that the 5 Sodder children died in the fire was made on insufficient grounds in December 1945 and has never been formally reversed, not because subsequent investigation established that it was correct, but because subsequent investigation was never conducted, because the official record is self-reinforcing in a way that requires extraordinary effort to challenge and that resists challenge even when that effort is made. George Sodder's extraordinary effort did not produce a reversal. The billboard did not produce a reversal. The investigators did not produce a reversal. The photograph in 1967 did not produce a reversal. The beef liver in the ash did not produce a reversal. Everything that the family did across 44 years of searching, everything they documented and reported and publicized and argued, produced extensive public awareness of the case and no formal change in the official record. The wall held. The record stands. The children are officially dead and officially buried in the ash of a house that burned on Christmas Eve of 1945, and the reality that no one knows whether that is true has never been incorporated into the official account of what happened. The Italian political dimension of the case, the thread that connects the fire to the threats that George received in the months before it, deserves more investigation than it has historically received, partly because it requires engaging with the specific historical context of Italian-American communities in the 1940s and the real and documented violence that political conflict within those communities sometimes produced, and partly because the investigators who closed the case in 1946 were not inclined to pursue it. George's account of the threats he received is consistent and specific. The man who came to his property said things that constituted a threat, and the threat was connected to his political opinions, and the threat was followed, within months, by the fire. Whether the causal connection between the threat and the fire is real, or whether it is the retrospective attribution of causation that trauma and grief produce in people searching for meaning in catastrophe, is something that the investigation of 1945 could theoretically have determined and chose not to determine. The labor market and the trucking business that George operated in West Virginia in the 1940s also had its own politics, and those politics intersected in various ways with the Italian immigrant community that George was part of. Labor organizing in the coal fields and in the industries that served them had been a site of intense and sometimes violent conflict in West Virginia for decades, and men who operated businesses in that environment navigated relationships with various kinds of power that were not always transparent or comfortable. Whether George's business activities had created enemies or complications beyond his political statements about Mussolini is something that the case file does not resolve, because the investigation that might have established it was not conducted. What remains, after all of this, is the specific and irreducible fact of the Sodder family's loss, a loss that was different in kind from most losses because it could never be given the shape that grief requires. The 5 children who were upstairs in the house on Christmas Eve of 1945 were, in the days before the fire, people in the middle of their lives, people with Christmas Eve expectations and the specific awareness of children who know that tomorrow morning will bring the particular magic of Christmas morning. Maurice, at 14, was at the edge of adolescence's transition into young adulthood, the age at which the world begins to feel like something you are about to move into rather than something you are living inside. Martha, at 12, was at the cusp of the specific flowering that 12 marks in girls, the beginning of the person she was going to become. Louis, at 9, was in the middle of the specific suspended childhood of 9, young enough to be entirely inside the child's world, and old enough to be aware that it would not always be the world he lived in. Jennie Jr. at 8 and Betty at 5 occupied the younger end of this range, the end where children are most entirely in the world of being children, most entirely themselves in the specific mode of childhood, least aware of what they were going to become. They went to bed on Christmas Eve and did not come down in the morning. Whether they died in the fire or survived it, whether the morning of Christmas 1945 found them in the ash or in a car on a road somewhere in West Virginia, they were never again the children who went to bed in that house on that night, and the family they went to bed in was never again the family it had been when they closed their eyes. The Christmas morning after the fire is something the record does not dwell on at length, perhaps because the imagination resists it too strongly. The specific quality of a Christmas morning in a house where the previous night's fire has destroyed 5 children and the house itself, and the holiday decorations, and the stockings, and the presents, and every physical trace of the celebration that was supposed to happen. George and Jennie, and the 5 surviving children standing in the ash of what had been their home, on what was supposed to be the best morning of the year, understanding that 5 of their family were gone in a form they did not know, that the world had been permanently divided into before and after, in the most specific and the most brutal of ways, that the Christmas they had been anticipating had become the day they would spend the rest of their lives looking back from. Jennie Sodder lived until 1989, which means she spent 44 years with the specific task of going through each Christmas Eve in the knowledge that it was the anniversary of what she could not fully name because she did not know what it was. Not the anniversary of the children's deaths, because she never accepted that they were dead. Not the anniversary of their disappearance exactly, because the word disappearance implies something that happened in the ordinary world, and this was not ordinary. It was the anniversary of the night when the world divided, and 5 of her children moved to the other side of that division, and she was left on this side, unable to reach them, unable to call them back, unable even to know which world they were in. She did not stop searching. She did not accept the official conclusion in any year of the 44 years she lived after the fire. She maintained the billboard and maintained the letters and maintained the family's public position that the children were not confirmed dead and that the case should not be considered closed. She outlived George by 20 years, and she carried the search alone through those 20 years. She died in 1989, and the billboard came down, and Sylvia buried the box. The photograph of 1967 is the specific detail that the mind returns to, because it is the most concrete piece of evidence that something may have survived the fire other than ash. A photograph of a young man sent anonymously to the family 22 years after the disappearance, with writing on the back connecting him to Louis Sodder. Whether it is what it appears to be, whether the man in the photograph is the boy who was 9 years old in 1945, grown into a young man of roughly 30, whether the words on the back represent a genuine attempt at connection from someone who knew or was the missing child, or whether it is something else, a hoax or a coincidence or a well-meaning error, is something that the investigation of the time could not establish, and that time itself has made progressively harder to establish, as the people who could have identified the young man have died. If the photograph is genuine, if the young man in it is Louis Sodder, then several implications follow. He was alive at 26. He was somewhere accessible enough to be photographed and to receive a letter addressed to his family. He knew, or someone near him knew, the address of his parents in Fayetteville. He chose, or was chosen for, a form of contact that was indirect and deniable, that sent evidence of existence without enabling reunion, that told the family he was alive without enabling them to find him. And he was not alone, because the note indicated 4 surviving Sodder children rather than 1, suggesting that whatever world he was living in 1967 was a world he shared with at least some of his siblings. The alternative, that the photograph was not genuine, that the man in it was not Louis Sodder, that the note was the product of a cruel hoax or an honest mistake or something in between, is equally possible from the available evidence. The photograph was never definitively identified. The family believed they recognized the resemblance, but belief and identification are not the same thing, and the specific kind of recognition that a family might have for a sibling or a child last seen as a young child, projected forward 20 years, is a recognition that is deeply human and deeply unreliable, shaped by desire and by the specific mechanism by which the mind fills in what it wants to see. This is the territory the Sodder case occupies, and has always occupied. The territory where what can be established and what cannot be established meet and cannot be separated. where the evidence points somewhere without arriving anywhere, where the questions multiply rather than resolving as more attention is brought to them. 8 decades of attention from the family and from investigators and from the public and from researchers have not resolved the case. The evidence that exists is insufficient to establish whether 5 children died in a fire or were taken from it, and the evidence that would have been sufficient to establish this was not gathered at the time when it could have been gathered, and that gap between what could have been known and what is known is the permanent form of the Sodder case's injury, the wound it inflicted on a family and on the historical record that has never been closed. Maurice Sodder would be in his mid-90s if he were alive today. Martha would be 93. Louis would be 89. Jennie Jr. would be 87. Betty would be 84. These calculations are themselves a form of the case's particular horror, the arithmetic of survival that the case forces on everyone who engages with it seriously, the ongoing computation of ages and years, and the specific question of whether the bodies that would occupy those ages exist somewhere in the world or were consumed in a fire in 1945. The children are either very old or they are not alive at all, and the case has never produced the evidence that would distinguish between these possibilities. George Sodder is buried in Fayetteville. Jennie Sodder is buried with him. The box that Sylvia buried on the hillside contains the accumulated record of their 44 years of searching, the letters and the photographs and the notes and the documents that constitute the family's own archive of the case, the history of what they found and what they were told and what they could not verify and what they could not forget. That box is sealed, and the hillside is identified only to the family, and whatever is in it is in the particular custody of grief and privacy that the family has maintained around the case since Jennie died. The case is officially closed in the sense that the official record has never been reopened. It is not closed in any other sense. The specific question it poses, the question of what happened to 5 children on Christmas Eve of 1945, remains unanswered, and nothing about the current state of the evidence or the current state of the investigative attention suggests that it is about to be answered. The records that might have resolved it, the investigation that was never conducted, the forensic examination that was never performed, the witnesses who were never adequately interviewed, belong to a moment in 1945 and 1946 that recedes further from reach with every year that passes. What does not recede is the question itself. It stays in the present tense in the way that unanswered questions about human lives always stay in the present tense, because the answer, whatever it is not in the past, but in the evidence that exists now or does not exist now, in the records that survived or did not survive, in the DNA that might be available or might not be available, in the descendants who might exist or might not exist, in the possibility that somewhere in the world there are people who know what happened and have not yet said. The night of December 24th, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, was cold and clear, the kind of winter night in the Appalachian Hills that has a specific quality of stillness, the kind of night when the stars are very bright over the ridges and the air smells of cold and wood smoke, and the particular winter smell of a landscape that is dormant and waiting for spring. A family was in a house. They had celebrated Christmas Eve. The children had gone to bed. The parents had stayed up. And then the fire came, and the morning came, and the world the family had been living in was gone. 5 children, 1 night. The question that followed them into the ash or out of it, and that has never been answered. The billboard that stood for 40 years. The box buried on the hillside. The photograph of a young man who may or may not have been Louis Sodder. The parents who spent their lives in the specific unbearable space between certainty and uncertainty, and who died there, and who are buried in the town where it happened, and whose story is still being told because the story has not ended. because endings require knowing, and what this story has never had is the specific mercy of knowing. Where are the children? The fire is cold. The question is not,